Good morning and welcome to the Power of 10. I'm Margot Fosnes, Board Chair for Cumberland Region Tomorrow, the host for the Power of 10. Cumberland Region Tomorrow was founded as a forum for discussion and collaboration around topics of interest of growth and development issues in the Middle Tennessee region. We want to ensure that our communities are vibrant, prosperous places that ensure a high quality of life that so many individuals and businesses have been inspired by to call this place home. Typically, we would be together in a room, but like so many things this year, we are doing things a little bit differently. I'm personally very excited to be welcoming Brent Toderian from Vancouver to give us our keynote address. We also have a great panel of mayors and planners who will share their reactions to Brent's ideas and how those ideas might be useful in their own communities. The Power of 10 wouldn't be complete without the opportunity to engage you and to allow you to engage with others in breakout sessions. To that end, your registration will entitle you to participate in 4 one-hour forums taking place through the end of September. These forums, led by Cumberland Region Tomorrow board members, will discuss issues raised here today around 4 topics in the growth and development arena. Watch your email for more details about dates, times, and speakers. I encourage you to listen, to participate, and to help us create strategies that will help our region emerge from this pandemic season stronger and better than ever. Before we begin, let's take a look at your dashboard. On the right side of your screen, you will find the chat and Q&A tabs. Near the end of the broadcast, we will have panelists answer questions submitted during the event. If you have an interest in a question already entered, click the Upvote button. That will make that question rise in priority. You can view the broadcast in full screen mode by closing the chat and Q&A by clicking the down arrow in the upper right-hand corner of each feature. You can reopen them if you elect to use them later in the broadcast by clicking the chat icon. It will open all features. Now that you understand how the platform works, let's begin. This event cannot happen without the generous support of many individuals and organizations. Please join me in thanking Pinnacle Financial Partners, who is our presenting sponsor, and our keynote host, the Greater Nashville Realtors. I am also deeply appreciative of the many other businesses, individuals, and organizations that have partnered with us to sponsor today's virtual event. We are also incredibly grateful for the local expertise here at Stage Post Studios, who are managing the virtual platform and the production. Now, I'd like to introduce Gina Scott, Cumberland Region Tomorrow board member and Senior Vice President of Pinnacle Financial Partners.
Good morning and welcome. Pinnacle Financial Partners is excited once again to be the presenting sponsor of this great forum. We choose to support the Power of 10 because we live here, work here, and we love this region. The conversations hosted by the Power of 10 help us to find ways to make our communities better. So, on behalf of Pinnacle, I welcome you to the Power of 10, and I hope you take away great ideas and inspiration on how we can work together for a better Middle Tennessee. Now it is my pleasure to bring to the stage Jaron Springer of the Greater Nashville Realtors.
Gina, thank you, and welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of the 5,400 members that make up Greater Nashville Realtors. We're committed, like all of you, to ensuring that our region is a great place to live. And we're pleased to help bring to the Power of 10 a great urban thinker, a practitioner who will share with us ideas and insights from his work with cities around the world. As founder of Toderian Urban Works, Brent Toderian has helped communities from Oslo to Auckland create places that are livable, competitive, and vibrant. And today he'll bring his expertise to Middle Tennessee. It's my pleasure to introduce, from his home in Vancouver, Brent Toderian.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you to the hosts and the folks in Middle Tennessee who have not only invited me to participate today, but also particularly who have helped me understand the issues and some of the challenges you have in Middle Tennessee. I should say that usually at this point in an exercise, I've spent a few days in a place before I'm having a talk with folks like you, learning, asking an incessant amount of questions. And of course, because of COVID, I haven't been able to do that in this context. But I will say that at least I am thankful that I've had the benefit of being to Nashville before. I apologize for those of you outside of Nashville. I haven't had a chance to explore the larger region and the larger Middle Tennessee area, but I have had a chance to be to Nashville most recently in 2017. My father, I told the organizers that my father actually just recently retired as a sound engineer at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel. My family has deep country music roots. And my father got his dream job to do sound engineering at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel. And I've had an appreciation for Nashville for many reasons, and that's certainly one of them. I'm going to just share my screen and take a minute and a second and do that to get things started. I am very aware of the fact that in me, you are inviting someone who is a little different than let me see here. A little different than some of your other previous speakers. And I will address that rather bluntly because that's the kind of candid person I am as I go through my talk. When I have visited Nashville, I probably had the same impression as many people have. This was my first evening in Nashville. It's amazing to see these crowds and watch these crowds now and think of how nervous they make me feel in the COVID era. But certainly at the time, I thought what a vibrant and exciting downtown that Nashville has as a center of a region. I was very impressed by the amount of public investment, and that's certainly how I see it, as an investment in the public life, the public realm, the great spaces in Nashville. And certainly we can have a debate about how well these spaces actually work. I spent some time observing whether people were in these spaces on a daily basis when there wasn't a Tennessee Titans game on, for example. But certainly I was impressed by the amount of space and investment that went into public life and public realm, and in the small details of the city as well. I should say I spent most of my time within walkable distance or bikeable distance of central Nashville. And so that's largely my experience. But I did also spend some time with some very knowledgeable Uber drivers who I asked to take me around to some of the various redevelopment areas in the larger Nashville area. I was very impressed at the time about the infill, the kind of mid-rise and ground-oriented projects that you were seeing around Nashville area. Although I was looking for more variations, in particular height and density, it seemed to go, once you got out of the central core of Nashville, it seemed to get pretty low rise pretty quickly. And so I was looking for more examples of mid-rise and transitional density. But I certainly saw a lot of good examples, I thought, at the time of ground-oriented density, the kind of densification that allows you to still keep that relationship with the street and the ground level. Interestingly, after I did that last trip in 2017, I tweeted about some of my observations in Nashville, and I ended up getting contacted by a writer for New York Magazine. I know you folks in Middle Tennessee probably care an awful lot what folks in New York City think of you. I'm being a bit sarcastic. That ended up turning into an article for New York Magazine. Downtown Nashville is supposed to be the model of the walkable 20th century city. I'm not so sure, writes the author. And when he quoted me several times in the article, one of the things he quoted me as saying is these small moments of improvement, and I'm talking about things like the public realm investment and the infill housing, in a sea of business as usual, don't begin to deal with the insidious addiction of cars, wide roads, and free parking. It's not enough to build big. If Nashville really wants to live up to its aspirations, it will have to. And you notice I stopped my quote there. I'm not going to give away the answer I gave in the article. You can look up this article, but I'm being a bit cute. The truth is, the answer I gave in the article wasn't particularly impressive. What I decided is that I would spend this presentation answering that question. And so I've sort of used this article and this quote as a bit of inspiration for how I wanted to tackle my messaging to you today. So we'll see how well that works, because I haven't tried that before. I also noticed on that trip that at least in one of your tourist facilities, I found this T-shirt. I was always curious about the branding of cities. And I found it interesting that Nashville was branding itself, at least in the context of that museum, as the city that listens. And I certainly know that's about listening to music, listening to not just country music, but all music. But I suspect I'm not the first one to try to create a double meaning for that. The city that listens, hopefully in the context of very good and engaging public engagement on how we are going to transform the city over time. But I'm actually inspired by this phrase today because I'm an outsider, and I'm curious to see if you're a city that will listen when an outsider gives you a rather blunt assessment of some of the things you may need to do better. So this is a theme for my talk as well. Are you, Nashville, a city, and Middle Tennessee, a city, a region, a portion of Tennessee that will listen when an outsider gives you a hopefully helpful, but certainly candid assessment of things? And I stress that because in all of my talks, I use this kind of starting point. I point out that at some point in my talk, most of you will be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language. And those are, we could never do that in our city or our region or our portion of the state. It's amazing the amount of energy that goes into a culture of excuse or the amount of creativity that goes into explaining why you are different than some other place because of fill in the blank. And in my experience, I've worked all over the world. And in my experience, the cities that are doing remarkable things are the ones that have gotten away from this culture of excuse and have embraced a culture of learning from other cities, not necessarily copying them, being inspired by them, competing with them, and figuring out ways to have better outcomes in their city and never, ever focusing on what they can't do and why they can't do it, because that really just is an excuse. But let's talk about it, some of the excuses, since I am an outsider. Let's pull a few elephants out from under the table. I know that Middle Tennessee is not like Vancouver exactly. I know that. I also know that you're not in Canada, and Canada is different from the United States, although I would say not as different as you might necessarily think. But both of those, to a certain extent, are excuses, because I'm not going to let you write off what I say because you say, well, Vancouver's different. First of all, I've been doing this city building for 28 years. I spent 6 of those years as the chief planner of Vancouver. So if my math is correct, that's 22 years where I wasn't working in Vancouver. And in most of that, I've worked in the private sector, working in cities all over the world, including all over the United States. So you don't get to write me off as just a Vancouverite from Canada. Although this is my city where I live now and where I was chief planner for 6 years. You're right, you know, it does look different than where you are from. There's lots of things that are different, but there are lots of things that most cities aspire to. Vancouver has been called a city by design. It's been ranked in so many things, it's rather remarkable how many different things you can compete with as a city. Most livable, most healthy, most reputable in terms of reputation for investment, most visitable by Condé Nast from a tourism perspective, top green city, top innovative city, top walking, transit, biking, top coffee city, which my clients in Medellin, Colombia just laugh at, top beach city. Here's the point. Vancouver is an extremely economically successful city. And I know that matters to folks in the United States. Nothing about what I'm talking about is socialism. Nothing about what I'm talking about isn't about success, and particularly the economic success of cities. So I stress that. And if you're thinking about all those tall towers I showed you in the downtown, this is the majority of Vancouver. Low rise, struggling with issues of getting to different scales of low and mid-rise urbanism in the context of complete walkable communities. We have, this is one of the first national heritage sites in Canada. We have historic areas. This is Gastown in Vancouver. We are part of a region that has 21 separate municipalities that struggle for a sense of cohesive identity. I suspect that sounds familiar to you because that is something I find is true in many regions across North America. But a difference is in Vancouver, the region is connected by light rail and creating a series of high density mixed use city centers and town centers that are well connected by transit, high order transit. So there's a very high order vision that's been being built over many decades to connect the region in a way other than the car, which does make us different than many other North American regions. If you're still not convinced about Vancouver, that's okay, because I spent 6 years before I was chief planner of Vancouver planning for a city in Canada called Calgary, which is often described as the most American of Canadian cities. It certainly is the most right wing. This is oil country, foothills country, dinosaur land where the dinosaurs became oil. And the oil and gas sector pretty much dominates the economy. This highly conservative city, where I spent an equal amount of time planning for over 6 years, is doing some of the most remarkable and innovative smart city building things anywhere in North America in terms of investing in urban design, public realm, beautiful cycling bridges designed by Santiago Calatrava, great architecture as an economic stimulus, as an economic benefit, great development at every potential scale. So the point is, whether you are from a city that is considered a right-wing city, a city that is considered a left-wing city, there is smart and dumb. There is good investment. The only difference I really found in planning for these two cities, this right-wing and this left-wing city, is the case you had to make to the politicians. And what I certainly found is that in Calgary, we always made the business case. The good news is everything I'm talking to you about today has an extremely strong business case. The data, the facts, the analysis is all there to support it. As an example, this city, Calgary, had one of the best and most innovative and successful bike lane network pilot trials over a few years ago that was so successful it was made permanent unanimously by a council that started off extremely skeptical about separated bike lanes. And it goes to show that even in an oil city and a car city, you can make these decisions about multimodal transportation, more choice for people, more freedom for people, if you get past the ideology and follow the math and the data and the analysis around actual success. In planning for cities all over the world, I've planned for some of the richest cities like Oslo, Norway, some of the poorest cities like many Latin American cities. One of the most inspiring cities I worked for is Medellin, Colombia, which is known as the Medellin Miracle, because it was literally in the 1990s the murder capital of the world. You think you have challenges and problems in Middle Tennessee. I guarantee you they are nothing compared to the challenges that Medellin was facing under Pablo Escobar and guerrilla warfare and car bombs and politicians and murder in the 1990s. And they have transformed their city, particularly around transportation, with bus-only lanes, rapid transit and light rail, cable cars that take them up into the radical hills and slopes of the city, repurposing technology from ski slopes after a minister went skiing, and even extensions of walking in these hilly areas, taking escalators from shopping malls and investing in porous communities of the city to facilitate walking and access to the city. The interesting thing about Medellin is they consider all transportation to be an equity thing, not just an economic incentive thing. It's about equal, equitable opportunity and access to the city and the opportunities the city provides. And they took back their public life after being afraid to be outside and having virtually no public spaces because of that. They took back their public life. I am inspired by this work I did with them over 2.5 years, because I always say, if they can do that, what's our excuse? Ironically, even for them, they were afraid still about going out and walking in the city. Interestingly, not because of murders, but because of what's often referred to as traffic violence. It's about getting hit by a car or the pollution from cars making you sick. And so a lot of the work I did there was about pedestrianizing the city and making it more safe and more perceived to be safe for pedestrians. So if you're still not convinced, I want you to know that I know that a lot of you in the audience are planning for places much smaller than Nashville. This is Kingston, Canada, the original capital of Canada before Ottawa took the job, and one of the most historic cities in all of North America. I've been their advisor for 3 years, and I'm actually giving a presentation to their council in about 4 hours today on a piece of work we've been working on. So I've worked in all of these scales, and if you're still not convinced, from those of you in small towns, this is where I grew up, in small town population 6,000, Perth, Ontario. I say all of this, not to give you my resume or my life story, but because I'm very used to folks, particularly in the United States, trying to write off my message, trying to write off what I'm saying to you. And I'm telling you, you can't, because everything I'm saying works in the United States if you get past your own baggage, your own excuses, and your own ideologies. So again, are you a city, a region that listens? And it's important that we listen now more than ever, because even before this pandemic, we faced pre-existing conditions, to use a term that you folks in the United States use a lot. I was calling it the 5 crises of global city building: the climate crisis, certainly, the housing and affordability crisis, the public health crisis that included pandemics and virus spread, but also just the epidemic of preventable diseases tied to how we plan and design our cities and regions, and our suburbs in particular, to make us not get any exercise, and diabetes and heart disease and even cancer associated with us not getting physical exercise in our day. The infrastructure cost crisis, which is literally bankrupting some cities, and particularly American cities. And the demographics crisis, as we get an aging population and the young folks don't stick around in many cities. That can be a crisis scale event in different cities as well. So we had a lot of pre-existing conditions, even before we were faced with this current pandemic and everything it has taught us. So whether you're motivated to address the climate crisis through better city making, and if you're not, you should be, and you should be connecting the dots between how we build our suburbs, particularly, and the climate crisis, or whether you just want to fix the pollution problem which overlaps with the climate crisis. Many of my clients, particularly in Europe, don't necessarily talk overtly about climate change, but they talk about smog, and they talk about how it affects our kids in terms of rates of asthma, emphysema, etc., with old folks. So this actually can almost be a more effective political tool to talk about smog. And many, many cities have done significant moves to address the dominance of the car because of pollution and its effect on quality of life, economic performance, etc., in cities. So this has become a very important conversation in cities all over the world. And by the way, a little plug for the simple technology called trees, street trees, tree canopy. If you only have a little bit of money to spend in your municipal budget and you want to accomplish a lot of things, one of the smartest things you can do is invest in a better tree canopy, a better urban forest, starting with street trees to make your streets even better. So if you're not motivated by climate change, maybe you're motivated by public health. Forgive me, I'm not trying to fat shame the suburbs with this slide, but we are connecting the dots between how we design our suburbs and our weight, our health, and the epidemic of preventable diseases. As an example, 4 top doctors, public health officers in Canada, held a press conference a few years back around Toronto, and basically said the best thing that we can do to make us healthier is not go to the doctor more necessarily. It's to design better, more walkable, transit-supported communities, because that's the single best, most important thing we can do for preventative public health. And it got a ton of press. It got a ton of media, more so than if the 4 chief planners of those regions had called a press conference, I tell you. We're trained to listen to our doctors. We seem to pay attention to our doctors when we don't necessarily want to pay attention to our chief planners. And this is a document that I encourage you to look up. Does density matter in creating walkable communities for public health? And the interesting thing is this was created by a client of mine who brought me in to advise on 6 Australian cities and states in Australia on better city and region making. And the client was the Heart Foundation of Australia. And the fact that a health body used its discretionary income to bring in a Canadian to try to convince government leaders to do things differently across 6 Australian cities and regions shows how important this is from a public health perspective. And again, that's even before we've talked about things like viruses. Public health and urbanism massively connected. And if you're not motivated by that, be motivated about money. I know a lot of municipalities, whether you're right or left, are motivated by very small budgets. Canada is actually in the lead of doing the math on urban sprawl, the math on up versus out growth. And for example, this just one city did a study that showed that over a 20-year period, just a slight change in the amount of growth that went to infill instead of external suburban sprawl made a $3 billion difference just in infrastructure costs. And that doesn't even count the things like public health costs, climate change costs, etc. It was the tip of the iceberg for the public costs and implications of growing out versus up. Once you do this math, you can't unknow it because it changes your perception. And I often say that the most powerful motivator for municipalities still is money. So this should really get your attention. Cities and suburbs are already changing and have been in large part because of this math, not necessarily because of an ideology about cities being better than suburbs. I don't buy into that kind of conversation. But what's true is the math, the evidence is substantially on the side of more infill growth and less suburban sprawl and transforming our suburbs to be much better than they are now. The bad news is technology is not going to save us. Driverless cars are not going to save us. Electric cars have just led to actually more cars and more driving, which has actually eaten up the positive effects of electrical power. And that, by the way, assumes your electricity isn't powered by coal. So these technologies are not going to save us. I routinely speak against the idea of the techno fix, the green fix, at the expense of the fundamentals of better city making. As an example, when asked to comment about Masdar and eco-cities like that in Wired, I said new technology can be advantageous. And I'm not a Luddite. I support new technology where it's used smartly, but it doesn't replace and it can't distract government leaders from the need to implement compact, walkable, complete communities. And it starts with a very good relationship between where you live and where you work, and where everybody lives and where everybody works, because that drives an awful lot of emissions and impacts, no pun intended, the word drive. The beauty is there's some really simple technology out there, bikes that have been around forever, wheeled luggage that changed our relationship to the airport and whether we could get there on public transit. And I love shopping carts that take away one more excuse that you have to use your car to get to the grocery store, assuming your grocery store is within walkable distance because you've got good land use. But I'll come back to that. If technology isn't going to save us, demographics might. The millennials certainly think very differently about urban conditions and urban lifestyles and not owning a car and putting off owning a car. Even now that millennials have gotten into the family raising ages and are getting older, frankly, they're still generally staying in large numbers, large percentages with a strong interest in the urban condition. And if economically you want to attract millennials as creatives and workforce for your neighborhood, you have to provide, or for your cities, you have to provide this kind of infrastructure to make yourself competitive with other cities. We saw that even in the competition for the second headquarters of Amazon. Big companies, little companies are looking at places where they can attract talent, and the talent wants to go to places that are multimodal, more walkable, less car dependent, healthier, with better urban places, etc. And the demographic in between the seniors and the millennials, the demographic that's having families or has been having families, the narrative is that they don't want to live in urban places, but that's not true. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Vancouver downtown, I'm looking outside at my window, has 7,000 children in our downtown peninsula by design, because we designed for kids and families first. We didn't buy into the self-fulfilling prophecy that families don't want to live downtown. And then we design our downtown in a way that virtually repels families. We are the proof, and many other cities are the proof, that if you design for kids and families, you get them. Frankly, often in numbers that will surprise you and challenge you, as is the case here in Vancouver. The beauty is that we have an ability to talk about density and land use and city building in a different way. I talk about what I call the magic of density done well, and all the things that if you do density well, it does remarkable things for all of your public interest aspirations: reduced energy use, making active transport and public transit viable and successful, more green design options like district energy, less sprawl, pressure on agricultural land, pressure on environmental land, etc., more affordable housing choices, even more equity and less racism. a lot or less supports for racism and systemic racism. So there's a lot of public benefits if you have a serious conversation about density and why to do it. It's not just about developer profit. There are public interest reasons why we need to be talking about densification. We really need to change the conversation about density in our public discourse, because it tends to get minimalized as, oh, density, that's just something developers want to make more money. There are huge public interest reasons why not only wanting density is the truth, but we need more density. It's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense is something one of my heroes, Jonathan Barnett, once said. I revere him, but he's only half right. The truth is, it's both. It does matter how dense you make it, but it also matters how you make it dense. I'm not going to talk a lot about height, because I know there's folks on this event that don't have particularly tall buildings. I will say this: I work all over the world in places where there's far too much attention given to how many floors a building has, and not nearly enough attention to how well height or buildings of any height are done. It's like the conversation about design begins and ends with how many floors are proposed. And you end up getting a lot of bad buildings when you have that ideology. Bad buildings of every size, including tall buildings. I actually call it the Montparnasse effect, after the Montparnasse Tower in Paris, where they did such a bad job building a tall building that Parisians hated tall buildings for generations until they built La Défense. If you do tall buildings, you have to have a conversation about how to do tall buildings well. And because I'm not going to talk a lot about that, I invite you to read this article I wrote for Planetizen about how tall tower debates could use less ideological dogma and a lot better design. The most important design element of buildings of any size is how they land. And I'm showing you a number of images about how buildings in Vancouver land. If you like ground-oriented townhouses, we have tall buildings that land as ground-oriented townhouses. If you like mid-rises, we have buildings that land as mid-rises. The point is that the towers are separated, stepped back. They don't dominate the perception of the streetscape. The mid-rise does that, and you end up with the best of both worlds: the walkability, the urban room that gets created by the mid-rise scale, and the density that gets provided by the height as people ride down their elevators and walk out into the neighborhood. Instead of riding down their elevators, getting into their parking garage and vomiting out onto their expressway. So it's the height becomes a basis to support the urbanism and the walkability because it's more density. So it matters how you do tall buildings. I encourage you to rethink your conversation about tall buildings, because I am sure you're having the same minimalist, reductionist conversation about tall buildings that most American cities are. Focusing on how the ground-oriented units actually support and facilitate walking, biking, and public transit trips. And it starts with that street wall, the idea of how everything is designed at eye level, at 5 kilometers an hour, or the equivalent in miles per hour, at the pace of the pedestrian. It's about rewarding the pedestrian for doing the best thing they can to help the city succeed, which is to choose to walk instead of something else. There's a lot of cities that have different ways of addressing the urban design challenge of making sure you have something always interesting going on at grade, at ground plane. New York City breaks down their street wall details into just dozens of different details, but ironically, then they do very little with it. So it's kind of a failed approach. In Vancouver, we have a much simpler approach, and we didn't even write it down in policy. Our unwritten law, our unwritten rule is no blank walls. Don't give us blank walls, because they're dead, they are unsafe, and they kill the pedestrian experience, and sometimes even lead to safety issues where people really are killed. So it can be as simple as making sure you're constantly activating the ground plane. Most important element of urban design, really. It translates into a way of thinking about streets, not like traffic engineers do, where it's about how many people can you move in cars, or maybe how many people can you move on foot. It's about not necessarily moving at all. And for years, for decades, long before this pandemic, I was talking about what I call sticky streets, which is about streets that actually don't facilitate people moving through quickly. They facilitate people stopping and lingering and looking in the store window, or sitting down on a patio, or enjoying a bench on the street, because it's a great street that they want to stay in it's remarkable how many people you can add vitality to a place just by doubling the length of time that they stay on a street, which is something we don't consider enough in the design of streets, and certainly from a transportation perspective. So I talk about density at every possible scale done better, with an emphasis on good design, particularly at grade, and know what I call scale dogma. The idea that we have a dogma that one scale is inherently better than the other, when the real important variable is design. A well-done tall building is better for the street than a badly done mid-rise building. We have to start focusing on the right variables. I'll skip past a few things. I was going to show you some examples of some mid-rise. Vancouver is known for its tall buildings, but we actually do mid-rise better than most cities out there, including our Olympic Village, which in 2010, when we hosted the Olympics, the U.S. Green Building Council named it the greenest community in North America. And sadly, 10 years later, it still is, based on LEED ND points, which I am embarrassed about for North America, because we should have exceeded that several times over by now. And this is the district energy system that did a lot to achieve that LEED ND status. District energy should be business as usual by now, and it's sad to me that it's not. It's more than sad to me. It's frustrating. It's part of my mission. But every scale of building, every scale of housing done with a sense of activating and strengthening the street, activating the urban condition, facilitating walking, biking, and transit as a goal of architecture, critically important. When I was doing my work in Vancouver, I used the words, I coined the words gentle density, hidden density, and invisible density to talk about the kind of neighborhoods that are transitioning, whether it's in a small town or a big city, but not necessarily wanting to stay the same. There's no such thing as a stable neighborhood, even though it gets written in planning documents, because neighborhoods are constantly changing, either getting better or getting worse. Gentle density is the kind of ground-oriented housing that my friend Dan Perolik actually calls the missing middle. And he's got a better brand than I do. I like missing middle, but I still call it gentle density because I'm speaking about the impact. The impact is gentle because these things largely, generally look pretty close to a detached house. Hidden density is laneway housing off the back lane or off the side drive. And invisible density is secondary suites, which should really be just a no-brainer for cities. You call them ADUs. We call them secondary suites here in Canada. It's the apartment, the rentable apartment within the primary house. All of these should be basic things done in every neighborhood as a way of abolishing the concept of single detached zoning, which more and more American cities are doing. As an example, I brought in laneway housing in Vancouver, and a lot of people said it's not that big an idea. What are you really going to get with that kind of housing off the back lane? And we're in Vancouver over 10 years, we're over 5,000 approved laneway houses. So it just goes to show you can have a little idea that can really transform things. And this is about neighborhoods where you can age in place, that are more nimble. It can be a rental unit. You can decant to the laneway house and give the primary house to your kids and grandkids so they can afford to live in their neighborhood. It just makes all sorts of relationships between the houses more possible because you've got the nimbleness that frankly trying to freeze your neighborhood in amber just doesn't give you. I've gone this long without talking about suburbs, and somebody, one of the organizers, can feel free to verbally tell me when I'm starting to get close to my time, because I'm just going. Suburbs are the most important conversation we really need to be having. I say the success or failure of our city regions and ultimately our survival depends on how well we do our suburbs. We can do the inner city and the urbanism almost perfectly, but we need to transform our suburbs and change how much of our growth actually is still going to suburbs as opposed to infill. And unlike many urbanists, I don't call all suburbs sprawl. I differentiate suburbia from sprawl. Not all suburbia is sprawl, but far too much of it is. That's the truth. And if you want a very simple definition of sprawl, it's car dependent. If you've got a suburb that is car dependent, where there are really no other rational choices in how to get around, then you're living in sprawl. And it doesn't need to be that way. Suburbs can have choices built in. We're just not doing that. We're getting this, we're doing this. So it is a choice. There's nothing written in stone that says suburbs have to be this way. There are better examples out there. We're just not forcing the issue. The great news is there is actual opportunities for transforming the suburbs. I have personally been involved with dozens of transformations of former suburban shopping malls, particularly in the combination of extending light rail or other forms of transit, even bus rapid transit, out into the suburbs. And because they have large land areas, they are the opportunity. In the United States, you have tended to do this when malls have failed. The phrase you used for decades is from gray fields to green fields, or gold fields, the idea that these are great opportunities when the mall fails. And a lot of your malls, frankly, have been failing far more than in Canada because you've overbuilt retailing substantially more than we did. We looked at you transforming malls when they failed. And in Canada, we started transforming malls while they were succeeding. That's a really big difference. Some of the most successful malls in Canada are sprouting towers and transforming into urban places because of the bigger opportunity. You don't need to wait for the mall to fail to transform it and have the bigger opportunity. Vancouver region here is studied by TOD, transit-oriented development experts from all over the world because we built so much of it. One of my friends and one of your fellow Americans, Ellen Dunham Jones, who literally wrote the book Retrofitting Suburbia, says that 40% of her examples on good TOD across North America are from Metro Vancouver. And it would be more like 60%, but she just doesn't want to talk too much about a Canadian city, especially when she's in the United States. We built a lot of it. This is a Mark I first generation TOD built almost 30 years ago. And it would never get approved now in Metro Vancouver, but I take Americans on tours of it when they come to Vancouver, and they say they would kill for something like this around their transit stations in their particular city. An example that's just finishing, we've got a light rail station that becomes the catalyst for the transformation of a suburban mall, a successful suburban mall. And this is what's just about finished being built. The interesting thing about this is everything you see in this image, except for the ghosted towers in the back, is actually being built where the parking lot is on the mall. In the phase one, they haven't even touched the mall itself. So the mall's been operating this whole time. And it's remarkable because it illustrates how much space we use for just the parking. Phase two is going to transform the mall. But man, you can do a lot just by rethinking that parking space. I'm going to skip past a few things. It's really important to talk about land use in the context of transportation because one of our favorite sayings here in Vancouver for decades is the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. There's very little success you can have with transit, with walking and biking, if your land use is still fundamentally doing the wrong things. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do infrastructure for transit, walking, and biking, but it's got to be connected with better land use decisions, or else you're just trying to connect people between nothing and nothing across far distances because you don't have the density in the mix and the land use right. Can I do a time check? Can any of my hosts tell me how much time I have left? I'll keep going and let somebody respond. The bad news is you're not going to be able to build your way out of this transportation problem by building more roads. We know that building more roads and more lanes and bigger roads just makes transit traffic worse. We've known it since at least 1955 when Lewis Mumford said adding car lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. But we seem to keep still trying, and Nashville and your region is certainly guilty of thinking that you can solve congestion by building more roads. You can't. It just induces more driving. Study after study and meta-study has shown that. As a matter of fact, cities, certainly in urban contexts, are tearing down freeways. And the most amazing thing about an inspiring example like Seoul, Korea, is not that they created the best urban place in all of South Korea. It's that the traffic got better when they took out the urban freeway because people adjusted their mobility patterns and habits. So this narrative that we need this infrastructure once we built it is just fundamentally flawed and wrong. In Vancouver, since the 1990s, we've been not balancing waves of getting around, but prioritizing, walking first, then biking, then transit, public transit, then goods movement, and then the car. We very rarely ban the car, but we prioritize it last, and not just in our public space allocation, but in our budgets, our municipal budgets. This is my friend Michael Koval-Anderson's much nicer diagram of the same thing. Here's it in Spanish when we built it into the transportation plan and land use plans for Medellin, Colombia. I've helped probably almost 24 cities integrate this into their policy, but more importantly, figure out what it means, because it's an easy thing to say. It's actually a hard thing to implement in terms of transformation. One of the phrases I use to describe this is the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision statement, in its plans, it's found in its budget. If you want to know the truth about a city, look at where you're still putting your money, notwithstanding what your vision says. Here's the point. If you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. This narrative that there's a war in the car, that this is transit riders versus drivers, as if people can't be both. It works better for everyone, because if everyone's driving in your region, then nobody gets around particularly well, especially in the drive to work. And it's going to be interesting to see how working from home plays out in the context of the pandemic. But this is still a fundamental truth. If you're planning all your infrastructure around driving, you're guaranteeing gridlock. You're guaranteeing gridlock, and you're actually making it harder for people to get around and hurting your economics. My clients in Oslo, Norway, wanted to actually tear out the freeway that was separating the downtown from the fjord, but they couldn't because it had national ownership. It wasn't under their control. So they buried it and they put it underneath and reconnected the fjord to the downtown. And I could talk to you for a day about the benefits of that. But this is what they replaced it with: a multimodal boulevard on the top and a whole community of office space, cultural space, residential space. This is where they have the Oslo Opera House, all in the space where this freeway used to be. And the coolest thing about this is this multimodal freeway with buses, bus-only lanes, tram, bike lanes, widened sidewalks, actually moves more people every day than the freeway did. Moves more people, not cars, more people. And as soon as you focus on the fact that transportation in cities is about moving people, not cars, you can transform your urban success. In terms of bike infrastructure, I do work all over the world in places that frankly have much better bike success than here in Vancouver. But I like to tell the Vancouver story because it's North American. We started with the recreational bike path. This is our beautiful seawall. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit in cities because you're not having to make tough choices with regard to car space. You don't get very far until you start to reallocate space for cars. This is our first separated downtown bike lane that was done about 5-6 years ago in Vancouver. Like every other place in North America, incredibly controversial. And it didn't necessarily work well because we did only one initially. And there was no network and there was no connecting lots of A's with a lot of B's. So people said, where are the cyclists? Well, once you had the network, the cyclists came in massive numbers by North American standards. We have in Vancouver the highest bike mode share for commuting of about, it's coming up to about 12%. We're the only North American city to reach double digits, which by North American standards is remarkable. And then I tell my clients in Europe that number and they kind of laugh at me and feel sorry for me. But they do recognize what a huge achievement that was by North American standards. It only happens if you're willing to create separated, safe, protected bike infrastructure, and we prioritize space for cars. If you're not willing to do that, you will never come even close to even the high single digits, let alone double digits of bike mode share. In Vancouver, we focus on all ages and abilities. We call it AAA. So not only providing the bike space, and don't get me started on things like bike paint for bike lanes and sharrows. You provide real, safe, protected bike space that kids would be safe in and feel safe in, and seniors would, and women who frankly are smarter about safety than men are. So you create that space, that's how you get the ridership. My clients in Groningen, Netherlands, which is the highest bike share city in the whole world, ironically, when I'm working with them, I'm working about reprioritizing space from bikes for pedestrians and figuring out how to deal with bike parking. So, this is a problem we in North American cities would kill to have. My clients in Ghent, Belgium, having similar problems. But this is the bike parking next to a transit station, showing that relationship in multimodal trips that European cities are so much better at than we are. You bike to the train station, dealing with that last half mile, and then you're on the train or the public transit. I've gone this whole length without talking about parking. All I'll say with that is that every great parking space has a parking problem. And usually when you're trying to solve your parking problem, you end up weakening the place because you perceive your parking problem to be that there's not enough parking. Your real parking problem is that you have too much of it, and too often it's free or too cheap. That's all I'll say about parking. Public transit. I really need somebody to tell me how long I'm going because I'm not aware of what the time is. Public transit, whether it's buses, light rail, trams, streetcars, the key is that it's a space saver. It makes cities and regions work because it replaces lanes and lanes of car traffic. We did the calculation of our SkyTrain here in Vancouver, and it's the equivalent, one SkyTrain line is the equivalent of 20 lanes of traffic. And then you have to factor in all the space for the parking, and then you really get into big land use requirements. It's the way urban places succeed, by saving space. You can't underestimate the importance of good old-fashioned buses, and particularly rapid buses, express buses. This is what we call our frequent transit network in Vancouver. The key to it is it's ubiquitous. It connects everything with everything, and it runs frequently, every less than 10-minute headways between
Brent, you have
buses.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Less than 10-minute headways. So that means if you miss a bus, you know the next one's coming. We all know the key to making buses really attractive for people is about where they are and how frequently they run. This whole thing about people in suits don't wear buses or don't ride buses, they do in places where the bus is predictable and frequent. So stop creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that's creating the reason why only certain people who have no other choices are taking the bus. My friend Jarrett Walker, the brilliant transit expert, has worked with me in many cities to help figure out a way to reprioritize bus infrastructure, particularly addressing this issue of ridership emphasis versus coverage. The idea that we're not trying to have everyone close to a bus stop, even if they're highly unlikely to ever use it because of land use patterns, to putting the bus routes and the buses where they will do the most good for ridership and mode shift. Cities have to be having this conversation, ridership versus coverage. It's a hard conversation to have, but it actually not only produces better ridership, better emissions, but ironically, and Jarrett Walker will blow your mind when you talk to him about this, actually results in better equity too in terms of access to transit. But that's another story. So the reallocation, the realignment of transit systems to make them more attractive to more riders by making them more frequent is a critical transformation needed in cities. And then the good old-fashioned car. Yes, of course, you think about electric charging stations and parking for electric vehicles, but don't forget about car share. Vancouver here, we have the most successful car share system in North America in the context of how many vehicles we have and how many people use it and how many members we have. The most important thing to know about car share is it transforms parking. It allows you to reduce your parking construction significantly. And we did a study of the benefits and showed that every one parking car share space replaces 20 personal vehicles going around the city. So it's a space saver. It's part of a multimodal city working with transit, walking and biking to reduce the amount of cars and retransform the space. When we're talking about space, I think we've all seen these kind of visuals. Munster was the first one to do it, I believe, Munster, Germany. This is actually my favorite from my clients in Santiago because they showed not only the difference in space, but they show how inequitable it is for a bus filled with people to be stuck in the same traffic with everyone else. So it makes the extra case for separated bus lanes for equity and fairness purposes. But this is our condition. We have prioritized most of our space. There's very little space left over for everything else after the space we've surrendered to the single occupancy vehicle, usually. And a friend on Twitter did this. They redid this famous drawing in the pandemic era and showed that it's actually even worse how much space we really have with everybody crowded in spaces wearing masks, trying to physically distance or social distance. Here's the point. Change and in our conversation about land use and transportation is never easy. If you are sitting here thinking, boy, this guy's from Vancouver, which of course I've explained, it's easy to have conversations about change and density there. This is a typical headline in Vancouver, density wars. I cannot open a paper without reading about communities that are furious about bike lanes, communities that are furious about a simple density project. As an example, while I was chief planner, this is a poster that one community did when we were proposing to change the height of a transit corridor from just 40 feet to 50 feet, one floor more. And the community's messaging was attack of the 50-foot condos. The point is, change is never easy, and it's not easy anywhere. What there are cities that are better at having that conversation about change. And we need to change the conversation from NIMBY to QUIMBY, what I call quality in my backyard. I got that term from Hank Dittmar, actually, an American. Because it is about a conversation about not whether to do density or not, but how to do it well. I'm gonna flash through some images at the end as I finish by just saying that as we're thinking about how we're building the permanent city, there's a lot of simple ideas for temporary fixes that could strengthen our cities, but it's remarkable how hard we make those simple ideas. And that was true before the pandemic. It's less true now. It's amazing how the pandemic has changed our willingness to make quick, simple changes. And I'll talk about that. So these were images actually that I used before the pandemic. My clients in Santiago, Chile, transforming parking spaces literally overnight for new public space. My clients in Auckland transforming their parking space along their waterfront as a catalyst for the redevelopment of the waterfront by literally overnight putting in planters, paint, and seating. Super easy, and people were using it the next day. We all know, I think, about the parklet movement, the idea of transforming our parking spaces. Boy, has this been an important and powerful issue during the pandemic. It was an issue before, but it never got as much attention. Don't underestimate the importance of food trucks as a way of filling the gaps and holes in our urban condition with urban life. And I also love containers. This is New York and Halifax and Oslo and Copenhagen. And my favorite example, Christchurch, New Zealand, who used containers to fill space after the devastating earthquake that knocked out 80% of their building stock. We think we have challenges. Boy, Christchurch had struggles. And they used container urbanism to help bring life back and fill the gaps. And other cities were inspired by that. So when we talk about the pandemic, I don't like the word opportunity because it sounds crass, but what we have to see this as is a responsibility to address those pre-existing conditions we had and transform our cities. Because if not now, during this time, not opportunity, then when? This is an interview I did for Vox about how to make the cities both livable during the lockdown and after the lockdown. Feel free to read that. Cities all over the world are doing big things from a parks perspective, an open space perspective, as big issues and visions as Madrid wanting to create a 74-kilometer forest belt around the city for bike paths, play areas, diversity corridors, and just to cool and clean the air of the city. Big visions, and every other scale of park and public space being addressed by cities right now, particularly European cities, because not only does it address the pandemic, it addresses quality of life, air pollution, economic success, attracting millennials. It ticks every box to invest in open space and public space for better cities. And rethinking our streets as a fundamental, the most common public space we actually have in our city, particularly now that we have to physically distance or during this pandemic. Oakland being a remarkably inspiring example, 74 miles of their streets being transformed almost overnight, literally overnight, rethinking the way our public transit is going to work in the context of the pandemic, and most importantly, after the pandemic. Bogota, Colombia was a huge inspiration, transforming hundreds of kilometers of their land for safe transportation to allow people to get off the Transmilenio bus rapid transit and have transit be more safe. They were the quickest to act because Latin American cities are much better at acting fast than North American cities are. But I have to say how impressed I was by Oakland. I commented that there have been a few surprise heroes. And I don't think anyone expected that Oakland, California would be cited and referenced by cities all over the world as an inspiration for what they were doing, opening up their own network of ubiquitous, equitable transformations of streets. I saw German cities in citing Oakland as an inspiration. Similarly, in the transformation of patio space or outside space for restaurants to come outside, so that restaurants can survive and that people can eat safely. There was another unexpected hero, Vilnius, Lithuania. I'm amazed at how many actual staff reports I've seen that have cited Vilnius, probably for the first time ever, as the city that transformed its central area as an outdoor cafe. And I sent a reporter who asked me to Vilnius. They didn't go physically; they got a local crew to do a study for our a report for our national news here in Canada. And right after that ran, we had city after city doing staff reports citing Vilnius to actually transform their rules, their fees, their speeds and timelines around transforming outdoor space for patios. The European cities are much better at talking about permanence. Milan was probably the first to talk about reducing car use after the lockdown as part of their strategy. We can't just think about these moves as temporary moves. They have to be about our pre-existing conditions and our pre-existing opportunities. Paris has done this very well, aligning it with the Paris mayor Anne Hidalgo's vision around a 15-minute city, which has become a remarkably inspiring thing for cities all over the world, including American cities, transforming their streets very quickly. We have a very small window of responsibility, not opportunity, to save ourselves from cars. I took this article from a few months ago. A moment like this, when millions of urban trips are up for grabs across transportation modes, is exceedingly rare. The stakes for cities could scarcely be higher. Sadly, many of the cities have already failed or are already failing at this because the cars have come back and maybe that window has closed. But I challenge you all to make sure that that is not the truth, because remember, the excuse of we could never do that in our city just doesn't cut it anymore. And as an example, I'm doing work for the Irish Redevelopment Agency that's transforming various Irish cities, including Limerick and Dublin. And Dublin was known as the city where good ideas go to die. Anytime something was proposed, they had a great culture of an excuse, of making the excuses for why it wasn't possible in Dublin. And I pulled this article just recently that my client sent me. And the quote in the article was, "Things that seemed unimaginable and unattainable until very recently are suddenly happening in Dublin city streets." It's remarkable. Dublin has become an international leader in getting things done when they used to be an international leader in excuse. And lastly, I'll say we have a sixth crisis. I've talked to you about the five. We have had a leadership crisis before and after this pandemic. We've had a leadership crisis of cities and governments that have lived on false choices. The false choice of fast development versus good development, good planning and design versus open for business. Do these kinds of things sound familiar? I call BS on false choices because everything we're talking about is success. And for those of you in America, I have to say this: it's not about right or left. It's not about political ideologies. It's not about blue or red or purple states. This is about smart or dumb. This is about success or failure, and making sure that your ideology doesn't stand in the way of your success. I hope you have been a city and a region who has listened today. But more importantly, I hope you do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent. Lots of good things to think about. We've got a lot of questions that have come in from our audience, and I'm going to start with the first. You kind of ended with this. How is COVID changing the discussion about density, and how do we move that discussion to the anti-density that is coming out of this COVID issue towards how do we deal with it?
I've done some videos on my Twitter feed where I've talked specifically about this. So one of the videos is pinned to the top of my Twitter feed, and you can click on that video and then scroll. All of them are attached as a thread. I invite people to take a look at that for a better answer. Very early in the pandemic, I was forcibly out there talking about how density was not the problem. And I actually wrote a piece for a New York publication asking Governor Cuomo to stop using the word density when he was describing their challenge, because I said it would do a lot of harm to our conversation. And ironically, density is not the problem. Crowding is the problem. And so crowding in public spaces, crowding in events is the problem. Density is actually a big part of the solution because it facilitates walkable grocery stores, it facilitates other ways of getting around, and it facilitates higher order hospitals. And And so very early on, I was part of a pushback to make sure that we have to stop, not vilify density. And that was important because you recall New York was one of the first hardest hit cities anywhere, particularly in the United States. Since then, and you can find that article I wrote on Streets Blog New York. Since then, all the analysis of where the cases have actually been has proven that there is no correlation between density and cases. As a matter of fact, the per capita cases is lower in dense places than in the suburbs. And since then, of course, New York has become one of the best places for cases, as lower density places have become many of the worst. So I think you tackle the argument about COVID being bad, density being bad for viral spread with facts, with analysis, with calling BS on people that are using the wrong language, and being forceful about it. If we let other people take the narrative with false messages, fake news, if you will, that you Americans love that term, then they will carry the narrative. And so I and others have been very vigorous and forceful, not just in pushing back, but proactively sending the proof, not just the message, but the proof that it's not about density, it's about crowding, and that density done well, which is an important conversation, is more critical than ever.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to make yourself full screen so we can see you a little bit better.
How do I do that? I guess I just take
Stop
off my
sharing,
PowerPoint.
yeah.
So I'm going to stop sharing.
There you are. All right. So how was Calgary able to build political and business support for those protected bike lanes? Any advice for Nashville?
I love that question. Thank you. This is a treatise in how to do a pilot for bike lanes. You should look at Calgary, study it, learn from it. They ran, I think, the best pilot for bike lanes I had ever seen. And they learned from a mistake we made in Vancouver, where we were doing our bike lanes one at a time. I call it pulling the Band-Aid off slowly, where each time we would do a bike lane, I would get asked by the media the two same questions. Why are there no cyclists or people on bikes? And I say, well, because we don't have a complete network. And the second question was, are we done now? As if, and I would say, well, would we be done if we had built only one sidewalk or one road lane for cars? So it was annoying and painful for me to have to go through that. They didn't follow our professional advice, the politicians, and they did it very slowly because they thought that would be more politically palatable. But all they did was pull the Band-Aid off slowly. What they should have done was build a minimum grid, a minimum network, and show the successes early. Because until you have that, you don't get the success that you want to show the public, show the media. So Calgary learned from that. And their pilot was a minimum grid. And they did a lot of analysis. They did a lot of before analysis of what the existing condition is. So when they could launch the pilot, and let's be clear, they won the council vote to do the pilot by one vote on council. And that was a hard fought vote to launch the pilot. And what they did after launching the pilot is they ran it perfectly. They got it done under budget. They reported out 2 months into the pilot with quick wins and early successes. So they started the reporting early. They defined success very specifically, not necessarily that there would be a ton of cyclists, because that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So they defined success and managed expectations. But what they said is it wouldn't interfere with roads movement significantly, and probably accidents will go down, not accidents, collisions, car crashes. Let's use better language. So they defined success and managed expectations very carefully. And as I said, they ended up coming in under budget. And when they presented the results periodically through the thing and then at the end, they had such great data on before and after that they took away all the ideological debates. As a matter of fact, the only ideological debate that was left was, I don't believe your numbers, which wasn't particularly compelling when in the face of actual evidence. So what was amazing is the pilot got launched by just one vote. The making permanent the pilot was passed unanimously. And you have to understand how significant that is in a city like Calgary. That would be like Dallas making a a bike lane network permanent. It would be equivalent to that. So almost perfect pilot. And then Edmonton, which is the other big city in Alberta, because they like to compete, not just in hockey, but also in city building, saw all the attention Calgary was getting and said, well, we want to do that too. And we want to one-up you. We're not even going to do it as a pilot. We're just going to design the network and build it. And they passed the motion to build it without a pilot because they wanted to be one-up their neighbor. I love the power of competition between cities and mayors.
All right, let's switch to transit. There's a lot of fears about transit in the COVID era. How do we convince people that it's safe?
Well, for a while, let's be clear, for a while, it wasn't. It was not safe to crowd people in. As I said, the problem was density. The problem wasn't necessarily, the problem was crowding. It wasn't density. And some early crowding was happening, of course, on transit. Interestingly, though, the actual studies have shown no outbreaks, no spread from transit. So, but certainly the idea that a lot of people in a confined space with poor ventilation in some cities is going to mean you're going to have greater potential for viral spread. And it doesn't meet our basic requirements for physical distancing of 6 feet or 2 meters. So we had to get people off transit. And the people, the cities that did this fast, like Bogota, did it by providing an alternative, transforming hundreds of kilometers of car lanes to places for bikes and walking so that people could take the pressure off the transit. So that was key. Then the transit responded by changing their loading patterns, making transit free so there weren't as many physical interactions, closing off every second seat. The good transit authorities reacted pretty quickly and made transit safe by providing opportunities for the physical distancing. But the ridership numbers dropped off dramatically. Interestingly, not because people went to their cars, because driving went way down. It was because, of course, the people were working from home, and we had a huge bike boom. We saw numbers of bikes and sales of bikes in North America that was, 10 years of normal transformation happening in a couple of weeks. So transit was off, but not because people were driving, but because they were doing other things like working from home. So during the pandemic, you had to do these things to make sure that transit was safe. The key is how you get people back to transit ridership. Everything that the good, smart transit authorities have been doing has been working. Even here in Vancouver, we just recently mandated that masks will be worn. And that was a very important next and last step. And I think that should be done. But it starts with people will go back to transit if it was a good transit service to begin with, if it was better than driving because they were stuck in traffic if they tried to drive, if it got them to where they needed to go. So it really comes down to, did you have a good transit system in the first place? If you didn't, chances are if people went and bought a car during the pandemic, they may stay away. But if you've got a good transit system, people will go back to it once you've made it safe. Unless you cut ridership because of this narrative that people will want to drive more, or you widen roads and put all your infrastructure money into cars because people will want to drive more, and you'll create a self-fulfilling prophecy that actually leads to people driving more and taking public transit less, not because of the pandemic, because that fear will go away relatively quickly after a vaccine is introduced, assuming it's introduced successfully. But the long-term effects of underfunding or cutting funding transit will be with us forever. And so I'm speaking out vigorously for cities to avoid the self-fulfilling prophecy of killing transit ridership, not because of vaccines, but because of not because of viruses, but because of the bad public decisions we make in response to the virus.
Okay. So back to the housing issue and density and creating more density in our downtown cores, particularly in Nashville. We talked preparing for this about 15-minute cities, and I told you that Nashville used to be a 15-minute city, not so much anymore. So we have seen a lot of residential growth in the downtown core, maybe not so much the completion of that vision for making it very walkable. But one of the things that's come out of that is, yeah, there's a lot of places to live downtown, not so much affordable. What can you tell us about, what kind of advice can you give us about making those downtown areas affordable to everyone?
Well, first of all, I did enjoy our conversation about the 15-minute city. To be clear, when Paris and other cities are talking about a 15-minute city, they're talking about a city where you can get anything you need within 15 minutes of walking or biking. The conversation we had is about whether you could get to the other side of Nashville or get somewhere in the city within 15 minutes by car. And that's a really big difference. But of course, a very important thing, because if the perception is you can get anywhere by car, then why would you consider taking public transit? And there's a lot of cities I've worked in the United States where that's been said to me. I worked in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, where they said, but Brent, we can get to the other side of Tulsa in 15 minutes in our car. But we changed the conversation to be a conversation about, yes, but can you attract and keep your young talent who leave the city after university because they don't want to have to be car dependent? And it became a conversation about that kind of transit city. Anyway, I digress. Your question about the downtown. We have about 120,000 people living in our downtown peninsula over the last 2 or 3 decades in Vancouver, starting from about 35,000. So we are the North American poster child for adding residential population to our downtown successfully. And the key is to do it in a way that actually makes it livable. Most cities are not fulfilling the contract, as I call it, because the contract is for living downtown is you give up private space like a TV room and a backyard for the public space that you get living in an urban condition and the access to the things. So the ability to go down your elevator and get fresh sushi or fresh barbecue in the case of Tennessee, and walk to school and parks around you and have all those things be there. That's what makes it a good deal. You're trading off public space for private space. But many American cities are not providing that amenity. They're not providing the daycare in the schools, quality daycare in schools. They're not providing the parks, the public spaces, the commercial things that support living, like a grocery store. And if you don't meet that, then you're just getting numbers of people and saying, why aren't we having more success? You got to get, when I talk about density done well, part of that is diversity and amenities for livability and lovability. It's the things people need to enjoy living in a place, and it's the diversity in terms of housing types and affordability types to make your population diverse. For affordability, you got to make sure you're doing purpose-built rental because not everybody can afford to own. You got to think about your price points and have it not all be high-end market, even if it is market housing. And you can use tools, of course, like inclusionary zoning for that, which American cities are actually further ahead on than Canadian cities. And we also integrate 20% here in Vancouver, 20% of our housing downtown in literally the most successful real estate market in North America. The most resilient and profitable real estate market in North America is Vancouver. Get that, those of you who are fiscally conservative out there. Even in a downtown like that, 20% of our airspace or land is set aside for what you call public housing, what we call social housing, for folks who would otherwise be homeless. So you've got all sorts of levels of affordability deliberately built into the planning. If you don't do it deliberately, it doesn't happen. If you don't plan housing for families, mandating a certain number of 2 and 3 bedroom units, for example, it doesn't happen. You end up with all studios and 1 bedrooms, and you wonder why you haven't gotten any families. One of the challenges that America has compared to every other part of the world is you've got an ideological resistance to regulation. You call it the R word. I call it the R word when I'm in American context. So when I say you need to, if you want families downtown and affordable housing for families downtown, you need to consider regulating the number of 2 and 3 bedrooms. For example, here in Vancouver, 25% of all units have to be 2 bedrooms, 10% of all units have to be 3 bedrooms. If we didn't do that, we would not have 7,000 kids downtown, period. So our success would not have been possible without regulation. So if you're not willing to get past your ideological resistance to regulation, decide what you want as a city, and put in place the rules and regulations that will clarify that for the marketplace. And once you've clarified it for the marketplace, they can factor it into price of land, which is very important for developers. If you're not willing to do that, then you don't get the success. You don't get the public achievement you want.
So you might.
Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer covering a number of
good. That's good. So you regulate those things. Are there also corresponding incentives for those types of developments that you want?
Yes and no. The number one incentive that smart cities use, including Vancouver, and I did a study for Sydney, Australia, of the 10 cities in the world that use this best. The number one incentive is the density itself that you are giving. We call it density bonusing. A version of it is value capture, which is a term used in the United States, in US cities. The idea is that even the things you want, like density, you shouldn't just give away. Because if you give it away, you're giving away value, which usually isn't taken up by the developer. It's taken up by the person who sold the developer land. And it becomes a windfall for the person who's owned the land for a long time, not more profit for the developer. If you make it clear what you want, and you build those things in to the price of land, then you can get the outcomes that you actually want. But density itself is an incentive. If you want to reduce parking, here's another one that'll blow your mind. I actually counsel cities to not necessarily waive their parking requirements, because I know that's the cool thing that all planning departments want to do. And you get articles written up about it, and you become a rock star city because you've gotten rid of your minimum parking requirements. What we do here in Vancouver is we've lowered our parking requirements substantially. And then you can get from low to zero by doing extra things that you don't have to normally do, like providing car share requirements or car share unit spaces and cars in your project. You can go from low to zero. So in other words, we've created an incentive for them to build car share. And let's be clear, that is the single most important reason why Vancouver is the most successful car share system in North America, because you can't swing a stick without hitting a private sector project that has car share in it. Great. And when car share is in it, people say, why do I need to own a car? The car share is right below me. That's how you make car share successful. That was an incentive, but it was an incentive that was built into something that replaced something that cities normally give away, either density or parking relaxations or what have you. I know some people in the audience aren't going to like that because they want these things to be given away, density and parking relaxations and such. But you have to think about incentives differently than you have been. And the main reason is this: if you're not requiring because you don't like regulation and you're trying to focus entirely on incentives, your American cities in particular don't have a lot of financial tools. You are the most close to bankruptcy of most cities I know in the developed, most countries I know in the developed world. Your financial conditions in cities, in many American cities, are dire. So the point is, you don't have a lot of incentives to give, and you often don't have enough to make it worthwhile. So you can't count on that because you're ideologically against regulation. You need to think about regulation and do the smart things in a way that actually helps business by creating certainty in terms of land use and things like that. Regulation is not a bad thing for business. There is a difference between smart regulation and dumb regulation. And then when you look at incentives, you have to look at them differently than you've been doing. Because I feel bad for American cities I work with because they're struggling to do so many things with so few tools, and they're ideologically against often using the most simple, effective tool they have in their disposal, which is regulation.
All right, we've got time for one more quick answer. I'm going to shift the focus from the urban core to what many of our Middle Tennessee counties have, which is more of a suburban and small town centers. Any advice for them?
Well, I talked a bit, and I'd love to talk even more about suburban town centers. It's interesting whether you call them town centers, regional centers. As I said, I'm very interested in the way regions get built. And notwithstanding that I focus a lot of energy on urban conditions, as I said, a lot comes down to how we do the suburbs, and because that's where most of the people are still going. So we need to make suburbs multimodal, and in towns and smaller settings, which often are more walkable already, more compact if they have traditional town patterns, how to support them better in terms of more successful main streets. The problem is, of course, that a lot of even those small towns have eroded their success because of the suburban things they've done on the edge. Suburbs were supposed to be on the edge of cities, but suburbs are now on the edge of towns. And the Walmart outside of town is sucking all the life out of Main Street. We've known that for decades. I've been struggling with that in my practice. So suburbs are a problem even in small towns. So a lot of the things I talk about car dependency and the taking of all the economic energy out to the edge instead of in the center, it relates as much to a small town as it does to a big city. And sometimes even more so. I worked in a lot of small towns in the first 10 years of my practice. And some of the hardest work I've ever done is work to try to save a small town, save a small Main Street from the predatory Walmart that is sucking the life of not just one small town, but maybe three, where the Walmart has gone right in the middle. Right. So I'm sorry if I didn't focus enough energy on that. I could probably talk with some of your folks for hours just on that too. But it's critically important. A lot of the stuff that I talk about is just as relevant. Yeah, you sort of have to squint at my images, not get distracted by the fact that my images are cities in many cases, because the principles I'm talking about relate just as much to small towns. And I know that, and small cities and medium-sized cities. And I know that because I've worked in all of those scales.
Great. Well, thank you, Brent. We really appreciate you spending the morning with us. We'll be sure to make sure that everyone sees your Twitter. I'd encourage you to follow Brent on Twitter. I've been doing it for several years now. And we might also send out some links to some of the articles that you've mentioned in this presentation so that the folks can look at them themselves. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure, and thank you again to everyone for inviting me. I hope to have an ability and an excuse to get back to your region physically sometime in the future, in the after time, when this is hopefully all over.
Great, thank you. All right, that's a lot to think about. We'll be looking forward to the panel discussion after this, but we're going to take a little break. I'd invite you to stick around for a minute and listen to some commercials from our presenting sponsors.
I'm Rochelle Regard. I'm the president of Grade A Construction. We used my own personal backing, to kind of get us started. As the job sizes got bigger and bigger, we needed help, and that's what led us to Pinnacle.
First time I ever met Rochelle was in a small trailer out toward Lebanon in metal chairs, a small round table.
They made us feel that it's okay. Everybody has to start somewhere. It was quite the change from us having to scramble and go to all these offices and kind of beg and plead.
She has got a entrepreneurial spirit. She has demonstrated she can lead a company. It's very impressive to see another woman in such a male-dominated field command that kind of respect. We were fascinated by it and wanted to partner with her.
Deb and her team have always been on our side. They trust us and they believe in our company.
We want to be seen as a true partner to our clients. Your customers are what bring you joy, and watching them succeed. Being a part of a company that is starting out and knowing that you had some small role in helping them succeed, this is what we're about.
No matter where you live has never mattered more. For over 100 years, realtors have brought local knowledge and deep expertise to helping people find new places to dream and thrive. The next great place you'll call home. So whether you're upsizing, downsizing, or just ready to make a change, look for the R.
Welcome back. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our panel discussion, Gail Carr-Williams. Gail has recently retired from Vanderbilt University, where she was the Assistant Director of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. She's been a longtime member of the board of the Nashville MTA, and she currently serves as the chair of that board. Welcome, Gail.
This morning. Thank you, Margot. What an honor it is to be here this morning. Wow, Brent gave us an awful lot to think about. And I'm so grateful to be able to have our panelists discuss their impressions and their thoughts about his discussion, as well as other issues that we talk about in transit here in Middle Tennessee and the region every day. So if I could introduce the panelists first. First, we have Mayor Chaz Mulder. Chaz is the mayor of Columbia, Tennessee. Next on our panel, we have Mayor Paige Brown, the mayor of Gallatin, Tennessee. Next, we have Faye DeMassimo, who is the senior advisor for transportation and infrastructure in the office of Mayor John Cooper here in Nashville. And next we have Emily Hunter Wright, who is the Director of Planning in the city of Franklin, Tennessee. And next and finally, we have Doug DeMasi, who is the Director of Planning for Rutherford County here in Tennessee. Welcome to each of you, all of you, and thank you all so much for being here today and bringing your expertise to this amazing discussion and to this amazing conference today. So, wow, Brent gave us a lot to think about, and I'd love to hear from each of you about your impressions or your thoughts about Brent's discussion today. So I'm just going to start in the same order that I introduced you all. If you all would just share with everyone your thoughts today and your impressions. So how about I start with you, Mayor Mulder?
Well, Gail, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here today, certainly amongst this very distinguished panel. If you could see my face under this mask, you'd see a big smile because I'm full of pride that I'm here, and it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate your service and what you're doing today. And I will say there were a lot of takeaways from the presentation that we just saw, and perhaps for me the biggest takeaway is the issues of the day for our region are the same issues that other regions, not just across the country, are facing, but truly across the world. And so the issues that we have here in the Middle Tennessee region are the same issues that are international and all across our country. And so I think it's crucial for us and for this region to be ahead of the game and to be innovative and try to think outside the box so that we can solve some of the problems of the day, because if we can do that, then our region will be at the forefront in terms of what's coming next. And over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, which is the kind of time frame that I like to think about, we can be either at the back or we can be at the front. And my preference would be to be at the front, recognizing there's a lot of competition amongst regions who have the very same problems that we do. And so I like the innovative approach and thinking forward and not thinking backwards.
That's great. Thank you, Mayor Mulder. But I want you to also know that while we can't see your smile, we see the delight in your eyes. So
thank you
for those comments. Mayor Brown.
Yes, ma'am. Well, I too am pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here. I do appreciate the programming today. I thought the presentation was interesting and informative. I did see one comment during the presentation that said something to the effect, "You're preaching to the choir here," and he was. But he framed some things in some new ways that I thought gave us some tools that we can use as we do address this problem. I appreciate what Mayor Mulder said about we are not unique in our challenges. I would really love to know, though, kind of where we are on the continuum in comparison to other cities throughout the world, similar cities. There are a couple of things that he said throughout the presentation that made me laugh, because I knew that our planners back in Gallatin were cheering and going, yes. I loved what he said about if you have a little bit of money, invest in trees, because I think we can all appreciate the value that that is to a community. But I loved one correlation he made, and that was the correlation between the attraction of young talent and the multimodal access in a community, or the transportation opportunities, or the lack of requirement for transportation within a community. So I really loved that. But initial reflections.
Well,
That's great. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you're here with us today. Faye DeMassimo.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with the other panelists today. And that was certainly a thought-provoking presentation to start us off this morning. It was especially a good point of reflection, I thought, for us as we, in the Mayor Cooper's administration, have been working over the last several months on a new transportation plan, a people transportation plan, people first, for Metro Nashville, and working with our partners in Middle Tennessee in terms of how that connects from a regional perspective. There were a couple of things he said that I thought were gave me a moment of pause to think about how our own aims are right now. One was the notion that don't look at what's in the plan, look at what's in the budget. You can put a lot of things in a plan, but where it gets real is what you have in your budget and how you're going to implement. And then I think the other thing that he talked about was the example about pulling the Band-Aid off. And the notion that I think I've been in this transportation business for almost 40 years. And incremental approaches to things have largely been how we have approached things forever. But the notion that with the protected bike lanes example that he gave, that rather than doing it in a piecemeal fashion, because he's absolutely right, when you only build one piece, it makes it so easy. People look at it and they go, well, there's not very many cyclists on it, and it's not really doing that much. Well, it's because we didn't build a system in order to enable it to perform that way. And the fact that they did one where he called it ripping the Band-Aid off and doing enough with the pilot that it could really show progress and could really show what the value could be of that kind of investment. Those were the two things that he said this morning that really provoked me to think further about our own efforts right now.
Well, thank you so much. And that budget conversation is always so critical for us at MTA WeGo. And it really does define how far you can go on many occasions. So I agree with you completely with that part. Thank you so much, Faye. Emily Hunter-Wright.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. I really enjoyed Brent's presentation. I think there were a lot of valuable takeaways and different perspectives. As a city that is geographically a suburban area to Nashville, I think I really enjoyed hearing his comments about sprawl and suburban environments, and I appreciated his honesty that suburban environments are not necessarily sprawl in and of itself, but that auto dependency is the key factor that perpetuates the sprawl. And I think, as I was listening to him talk, I think as we all know, those successful suburban environments are those that really focus on multimodal and focus on regional transit solutions to the greater metropolitan area. And I think it's really important, that we continue to focus on those things as a region and in our local jurisdictions, because, in the long run, really creating these successful nodes of mixed use and residential neighborhoods, we're going to need those multimodal factors. And I think that's something that Franklin's worked on for a while, but we need to continue to progress in that manner, because as we all know, so many of our suburban environments in the Middle Tennessee region are very auto dependent. And I think that's something we can definitely work on. And I appreciated just his directness and frankness in the matter. So I took that as one thing that will stick with me. And as we all know, as he pointed out, change is not easy. And I think that's just something we all need to agree on and kind of work through. So I really enjoyed his presentation a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. I appreciated his directness as well. I thought that was very refreshing. Very, very. So thank you. Doug.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning
Hi,
to everybody who's watching, and I appreciate being a part of this panel as well. I agree with what everybody said here so far. I guess that's one of the advantages of being the last one to speak. I can say, yeah, everybody did a great job. But some of the things that I took away after listening to his presentation, which was very thought-provoking, I think one of the first things, and that kind of goes back to what Emily was just saying, is that change is not easy at all. And I couldn't help but thinking through that as I was listening to a lot of what he said, that what we're going to be seeing is a lot of a mindset shift here over the next several years, several decades, whatever. And the way that we do things now, I think we need to understand is not going to work the way that they're currently working. We're going to have to make some changes, and there is going to have to be some sort of a mindset shift there, as well as the fact that I like what he was talking about. Technology may not necessarily save us in and of itself. Of course, it can help us in that regard. But when you talk about the priorities of the next generations that are coming up, the millennials, Gen Z, I think that's going to be a catalyst for a lot of the change. Something that I did think about, though, a lot as we were talking about this and listening to the presentation that he gave was, yes, these are important concepts for cities and suburbs, but also how do these concepts work in more rural areas? Like the area that I'm a planner in is more of an unincorporated area, which has a lot of larger rural areas as well. And some of these concepts may be more challenging to implement in a rural area and how that all interplays. But I think ultimately, if we want to keep moving ourselves forward as a region, those are things that we are going to have to address.
Absolutely. And he did give us so much food for thought. And I think one of my takeaways from him was his energy and also his we can do attitude, and to sort of accept barriers, but to get rid of the barriers so we can move forward. And I thought that provided just a great opportunity for us as a region to really think about what we want to do and know that we can, but it just takes a lot of hard work. So I truly appreciated his energy. Just to follow up with you a little bit, Doug, on so you don't have to go last again. So a little bit about when we talk about protecting agricultural lands and open space is critical to maintaining our region's character. What should counties in the region be doing to sort of make certain that we're creating that space and also protecting what needs to be protected in those spaces?
Well, there's a lot of things that I think you can do in those regards. I think the most important thing is just recognizing it as the resource that it is. I think and I'm not saying that it's a prevalent mindset, but not all land out there necessarily has to be developed. I know I've had conversations with people who have come in my office about rezoning, not just agricultural lands, but just property in general. And I've had the conversation with them to say, not all land has to be rezoned. There are a lot of counties, more rural areas, you're starting to see do more of open space plans, or protection plans, things like that. The biggest challenge that we face in our county, and I know some of the surrounding counties, is that farming and agricultural is not as big as an industry as it used to be. And what you see is a family who's been farming for all their lives and several generations, the next generation doesn't necessarily want to go that route. So when they get ready to retire, they want to sell their property, and of course they want to sell it for as much as they can. And they want to see, get with a developer that might be able to, maximize their investment in the property, which is understandable. But with everything, there has to be a balance there. There has to be a balance of being able to provide the housing and things that a community needs, even in the rural areas, but at the same time conserving some of those areas in order to continue the agricultural and the farming communities that we see. So it's not an easy answer in that regard, but conservation, open space plans, things like that. Going back to your comprehensive plan in a county, identifying which areas are more apt for development just because of infrastructure availability, and maybe some of those that are just better suited to have larger lots in a sense, especially in the more rural areas where there's not as much roads or water capacity, things like that.
Thank you. You do have a unique environment that you work with, so thanks for sharing that. Hey, one of the things he talked about, and you and I have talked about it before, is this concept of equity in our plans and how we do equity. And I know that in the work that you do, you take great pride in that, and it is essential in the work that you do. And I appreciate that so much. And so if you could talk a little bit about equity in design and sort of how does that help us to design the work that we're doing, and how does it inform our work?
Sure. Well, typically when we're looking at equity, especially at a system level in a community or in a particular system of a community like the transportation system, we do look at it from that sort of large scale. We sort of start from the top and go down. We think about it in terms of particular parts of the community and how they're connected, and all that is very important as well. That sort of more vision and aspirational and system level look. But one of the ways that we are sort of taking that approach and turning it a little differently and approaching it a little differently in the transportation plan work that's going on now is we've developed a tool called Equity in Design. And what we literally do is in every single project that's in the plan, there's an equity lens that is applied to every project, and every project is looked at from all sorts of, I think there's 17 different metrics of equity, so that we can assess how well we're doing at every project level. And if we do really well at every project becomes the system. And we've really built some extraordinary power of equity and strength into what we're doing. And it's a different way of looking at it, and we're really proud to have introduced that with the transportation plan update that's underway.
Well, that's wonderful, and particularly as we are faced with what's next after COVID, those equity issues are going to be critical in decision making. So I appreciate your leadership in this discussion and the implementation. So I think that's great. I'm getting some questions from the audience, and so I think this one question is probably on everyone's mind, and I'm just going to put it out there, and whichever one of you would like to answer it. It's how do we get leaders to prioritize transit in the budget? Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm not real sure of the answer, but I think COVID has brought a new challenge associated with that, because I think to some degree this area was on the right track. I think that leaders are always going to be scared of what the political fallout is associated with it. But I tell people, like I tell my father was like, the interurban, which was the train between Gallatin and Nashville, 60 years ago, only lasted a few years. And I tell my father, it's not about you riding that transit, whatever it may be. It's about giving you the opportunity to still be able to drive your car, because it's providing options for different people. And so I think particularly some of the very vocal naysayers don't think about it from that perspective, that it's not just they're not going to be forced to participate if they don't like, but they're going to have the opportunity to continue to travel as they desire. And so there has to be that understanding, and then how to attract leaders to serve that will support that. It's the grassroots piece. It has to come, the community has to support that and has to want that. I think that we got a lot of traction in the region with understanding that Nashville needed interconnectivity, and with that, when we could envision connectivity within the city of Nashville, then everybody started envisioning what the transit to and from Nashville looked like. And so I think the vision was very, very powerful, and I think after some time with COVID, we'll see some recovery and we'll get some more support going that direction. But it's also curious to think about how in the future, although his presentation addressed it some, how's technology going to affect that? And I liked to hear what he had to say about it, because it was a perspective that I haven't heard discussed a lot as how technology is going to affect that demand for transit, mass transit, versus how the autonomous vehicles will play into it. But
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think, first of all, as the mayor said, really it boils down to the people. And one of the things I like most about municipal government is really that is where people have the loudest and strongest voice. And so really we prioritize issues based upon the issues that people bring to us. And so as transportation becomes an increasing focus amongst the commuters, and in Columbia, we believe that we have about a third or so of our workforce that are commuting to either Williamson or Davidson or even Rutherford County on a daily basis. And so you would think that as that number continues to increase, which we anticipate that it will, that it will become more and more of a focus for our residents and our citizens, and in turn it will turn into more of a focus for the elected leadership. I also would say that in a way it's a little bit of a generational mindset, perhaps, that if you're at a point where you're either retired or nearing retirement, you might not be as worried about transit as an issue as someone such as myself, who's in his mid-30s and travels to Nashville regularly for work. But on the other hand, those people that might not have as concern about it, they have children and grandchildren who are on the roads, and we all want safety for our families and friends. And so if you think about it in a different perspective, maybe it doesn't impact you, but it impacts your family, your daughter, your son. And then the third piece of that, I would say, I say a lot that as goes Nashville, as goes all Middle Tennessee. And so we all sort of look to Nashville to be the leader in the conversation, and they are opening our eyes in Middle Tennessee to the transportation issues of the day. Regardless of which initiatives or referendums that you see, we see that the city of Nashville understands the importance of transportation and transit. And so as they continue to exercise leadership in that regard, which we're seeing now, I think that will flow to the remaining part of our region.
Gail, one other thing I would add to those comments is that, you know, for a long time we've thought about transportation systems as sort of, you know, predominantly roads, highways, and that kind of thing, very auto-centric. And then we thought about transit. It's sort of like these things are in, and the real way that we can make a more compelling case in budgets and for our community and our residents and our businesses and for elected officials that have to act upon all of these competing interests all the time and with scarce resources and so forth, is for us to really present the case of a multimodal system, which is in part what we heard from our speaker earlier this morning. It really needs, transit is a key component of a multimodal system. So it doesn't need to be that transit needs to stay out there all alone trying to figure out how to make a case for transit. We need to build a system that performs, a system that connects people to education, to jobs, to healthcare, to each other, to the places that they need and want to go, and does that in a safe way, effective way, efficient way, and also is placemaking in all of our communities. And so I think that I think the notion of sort of having transit sitting out there, I realize we have separate authorities and all those kinds of things, organizational structures, but nonetheless, when we think of it from a budgetary perspective in particular and a support perspective, we really have to think of it from that broader system level.
It builds community for us, yes.
I would add too that from my experience, I think there are two big cases that really need to be made in that discussion. One being the vision of how it's actually going to be implemented and the technical support from your planning documents that really show the leadership that is making these financial decisions on how it's going to work and who it's going to serve. And I think the other part is really looking at the economic impact of you know, what the transit will actually provide, in us really looking at how it impacts the business community, your recruitment, your investment in those local businesses in your community, and the need that they have for employee retention and recruiting. And I think that that's a big part of it too, that I think a lot of local leaders might really see some positives from.
The economic impact is the piece that will help us make the case for where the money has to come from. And I think that has been the thing for so long, is that where's the money coming from, and then by the time we build it, what will be obsolete, and then we're planning for so far in the future, we don't really know what that vehicle is going to be, whatever it may be. So
I'll mention one thing related to that. In a former life, The thing that really sort of tipped the scales for transit funding and transit support and transit activity in that multimodal system, and it relates very much to the point that you just made, is that in that particular community and in that case, they actually saw corporate locations and major job creating considerations going to other communities instead of to that one, because there was the workforce wanted to be in proximity to good transit service, and it wasn't able to be provided. That incentivized a very business mindset of that particular city, and took a few years, but eventually there was a dedicated funding source and a huge amount of investment in that space. And what has that done? It has changed that economic activity conversation dramatically.
And sort of to that point, I mean, we don't yet know what the fallout of COVID will be. We know there will be several different fallouts, but certainly one thing that appears to be pretty globally accepted is that there are going to be a large number of corporate HQ relocations and different businesses moving out of the large urban areas and the sort of the supersized cities, New York, LA, et cetera, and they're going to look to that next tier. In the Middle Tennessee region, led by Nashville, I think is going to be at the forefront. And so one of the components is going to be, and not that we are going to want or go after every one of those potential relocations, but I suspect that a lot of those will be good paying jobs and the type of recruitment that we want to see. And we've got to be, again, as I said at the top, at the forefront of the conversation. And they're going to look at several issues. They're going to want to know about the quality of the school system. They're going to want to know about the quality of life, but I think the quality of life piece includes several things, and that includes transit. You know, how quick can you get from the city of Columbia downtown to downtown Nashville? Because if we locate here, maybe our workers are going to want to be able to access the bigger city, even if it's working in a smaller town. So I think really COVID is bringing to the forefront, we've got an opportunity, and it's whether or not we seize it or not will depend the next 10 to 20 years going forward.
Well, it's nice to hear the word COVID and opportunity in the same sentence, right? So that, you know, this holistic approach to how we look at our cities and how we get around our cities is so critically important. And I thank you all for that great discussion, because it's all interrelated and it's all part of one another, which makes it great. Mayor Brown, I know you all are going through the process of updating Gallatin's plan. Have you seen a desire for making Gallatin a more, maybe as Brent would call it, a complete city?
Well, therein lies the disconnect, right? When the question about taking people from NIMBYs to QUIMBYs, the quality of life, it seems like every time that we try, or that a developer tries to bring us a development that has all the components that make it attractive to that young talent to be attracted, we go through months of public outcry because we are using up, all the farmland, and we're using up, houses should only be on 1 acre lots, and we're, the homes aren't the value of the existing homes, and they're adjacent to, and it's an insult to the homeowners that already live there, and everybody's heard the story. They know how it goes, right? And so our land use plan, we want to reflect what our community wants, but there's a big disconnect between what is smart planning and what our community thinks they want. And I wish we could draw the vision. I feel like right now we're actually kind of in a situation where we're going to show you. And that's really not a good way to work. Unfortunately, not everyone has been in large cities or even other well-planned suburbs where they can have the experience of what that looks like. Or do they understand, hey, this is a key element to your child wanting to come back to the area and live. And so that is, that's the huge challenge. I mean, I think we're doing a good job with the plan. We have had a lot of public engagement. We're actually kind of in that phase now where we're showing people what different options look like, and they can help decide. GNRC, as you may know, has actually led that for us and acted as our facilitator and organizer and leader, and they've done a great job with that, and we're getting there. Of course, it got slowed down by COVID, but I thought when he said that, a transportation or a comprehensive land use plan is so important. That's where your transportation plan lies. But yeah, it doesn't correlate with what your residents think they want and what is, a plan that makes your community have better long-term sustainability and is attractive for young people and provides affordable housing options, especially in this Middle Tennessee area where so many people are wanting to relocate.
Well, that brings up to ask all of you to respond to the question that I received from the audience, which is, how do we address the NIMBYs? And
can't wait for somebody to answer that.
I don't know. I'm on that generation that I need words sometimes. So, it's so it always comes out funny when I just say NIMBYs opposed to that in my backyard.
I don't know if I have the exact answer for that. Obviously, I don't, because we have our plenty long list of challenges with those in Franklin. But I would say that in terms of density, which is often one of the things that we get so much public outcry about, I don't think density is the answer everywhere. I think most cities will acknowledge that there are places that density is the right answer, but so many times in my experience, we are seeing proposals for density in places where it will affect the rural landscape and where it does have impacts on long-term farm owners and other property owners. But there are also aging corridors that are commercial, and perhaps that, a retrofit and renovation of those corridors with added residential density mixed in with some of these other commercial and office uses might be an appropriate solution. I think we have to kind of think about where it might work versus where is density the answer everywhere. And so I think that's an approach we might want to start looking at in some of our local jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I would kind of just to continue what she was saying, kind of a sidebar. Over the years, I've found that density is something that really is in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. I tell people, of course, I didn't grow up in Tennessee. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I could literally sit in my upstairs room and have a conversation with my next door neighbor in his upstairs room because our houses were that close. So sometimes when you hear, "Oh, that's too dense," it could be 3-4 units an acre, where someone who grows up in an area like where I grew up is more used to something twice as dense as something like that. So density to some extent is, I think, in the eye of the beholder. As far as how you combat NIMBY in that sense, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach for any community. It's really going to have to be tailored, and that's with any of the things that even Brent was discussing today, was not all these things are going to work everywhere. So I think a lot of it is just presenting the facts to people. Maybe they have some misconceptions about density. Maybe they have some misconceptions about what transit is all about, transportation. I mean, you name the topic. It could be one of a million things. Just trying to fight that, what their misconceptions may be, with information as far as, okay, this is what you think, this is, the data here, the facts back this up instead. Just kind of showing them that way, which is why public engagement processes are so important when it comes to like Gallatin's plan. Rutherford County, we're getting ready to start a process to do something similar to what Gallatin's done, actually using GNRC as a matter of fact. But as she said, COVID's really kind of slowed that down. I was getting started on that, but getting that data out there, getting people's input into the process, finding out what their concerns are, and using factual information on how to combat some of that.
Gail, you probably recall when we started the transportation plan effort in Nashville 8-9 months ago now, and we held the 11 community listening sessions. I'm reminded about the speaker this morning talking about being a listening city. But you may recall what we did was we took a pretty different approach. Public meetings aren't a different approach, But walking into a public meeting and saying, we're not here, we have nothing to present to you. We have absolutely nothing to present to you. What we do have is we've got $20 of play money to give you, and we've got 9 different project types. Tell us how you would spend a limited amount of resources across the, and again, it wasn't about, it's very easy if you walk in and you tell people something first and ask them to react to that, that's a different conversation. And then if you also even walk in and you ask people to look at specific projects, then you get into that, my backyard, my community, my this, my that. And instead you're saying, no, I want to, let's talk up here for a moment. Do you want more transit? Do you want more sidewalks? What do you think about state of good repair? How about bikeways and greenways? And so you've got these 9 different project types and you got $20. Those were some of the most revealing conversations we had with people where they would go, can I get more money? And you'd no, $20, that's what you got. You got to figure out how you spend that across those types. And we said, this is what elected officials deal with every single budget cycle, is trying to figure out how to take a set amount of resources and do a whole lot with it, right? And those conversations became very different. It was interesting to watch people's whole actual body language change when they came into the meeting, and it was like they were there, they were armed, they were ready to go, by gosh, they were going to tell us what they thought, and then it was like, wait a minute, we're not here to talk about a specific project, and it's not, I've got to kind of think about all this. And it turned the conversation around in a very different way. So I think those kinds of sort of techniques are helpful. And then I think persistence in what my colleagues have already described about, educating people and using data and all those kinds of things. But I think if we go first, not with what we want or the solutions, or we're the planners and we know, we're the staff and we know. But if we go in and say, what do you think? What do you think? Then we get a whole different dynamic started, and that's very helpful.
Excellent point.
So it's really interesting hearing this conversation, because one of the things that Brent mentioned was about cities not having a lot of tools or incentives to use. And so it sounds like from this conversation, a good tool for us to use is more perfected community engagement, as well as education of our communities, to have a better understanding of maybe some of the concepts that we talk about when we talk about change in our areas. So I really appreciate that kind of conversation, because those can sometimes be huge barriers that we've also heard about. And also, when you need to design streets and make better land use decisions for people, how do those conversations help to inform how we make those changes? And now several of you sort of have that challenge. If we could talk about that for a couple minutes.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So the changing of street design, he talked a lot about. And so the question that I have is, what do you need to design streets and make better land use decisions for people versus, and I'm assuming the question might mean versus those decisions tend to be made more for businesses than for people. So that's one of the questions from the audience.
I think one of the things, I'll comment first on that and then turn it over to my colleagues. We've been designing streets forever based upon design standards that have come out of the Green Book and other kinds of, forever, right? And so the notion that we need to begin to modernize our highway and street design standards, and that can be done some at the local level, and it's also being contemplated. AASHTO is undertaking some really significant modernization of roadway design that will be helpful to us. It's a slower process, but it is happening, and programs like Vision Zero that are driving us to a performance objective that we have to reduce traffic fatalities. Part of that is design, part of it is behavior, part of it is all sorts of things, but part of that is design. So I think that there are a number of, both at the local level and at the the state and federal level, as well as some of these other kinds of performance-driven objectives that are helping to influence that.
And Faye, this question I have from the audience is for you. Brent talked about the 15-minute city, the way it is understood in Paris and how it has been here. So what is the economic development impact of these?
What's the economic development impact of being a 15-minute city?
Yes.
Well, I
As
mean,
I read the question.
right. I mean, it can be quite substantial for sure, because if you have a 15-minute city of the sort of vision that he was describing in the practice in Paris, where you can just in walking you can get to places and things that you need, the stores, perhaps essential trips that you need to make are right there, and along merely a walking trip. You're not having to rely upon going and getting in your car. You're not having to think about the maintenance of the car. You're not even having to figure out how to go and get to, some other kind of transport mode. Obviously, that level of sort of personal connectivity to the market has got to be a good one. I think here. In Nashville, how we think about our relationship to markets and to places that we need and want to go, we're obviously not Paris, but I do think that the thought process behind where we want to go and what we want to be, and the notion that Mayor Cooper very clearly asserted during his campaign and continues to now, is that this needs to be a people-first transportation plan, means that connectivity to all sorts of things that we need to be connected to, including economic activity, that serves everybody extremely well.
One of the things that we're seeing in Columbia is, with regard to our city streets anyway, the streets in our road improvement projects are actually reducing the size of the street so as to enhance other amenities, whether it be a bike lane or whether it be on-street parking or whether it be park benches or benches along the street. And so, there's sort of a give and take. By reducing the size of the street, arguably maybe you're impeding the flow of traffic, but on the other hand, if it's about people and wanting people to be able to enjoy the amenities that go with it, where is sort of the where the rubber meets the road? The other thing I would say too, and you sort of made me think about it when you were mentioning just the mindset. In Columbia, we have a downtown parking problem. And one of the reasons that we have that is because we are of a mindset that we want to be able to park right in front of the business that we want to go to. Never mind when I go to the state capital city in Nashville, I may walk 5 blocks just from my parking spot to the courthouse or to wherever I'm going, and I don't think twice about it. And so part of it is changing that mindset. Another thing, everybody says in downtown that, well, a parking garage is the solution. But you have to couple that with the fact that a parking garage is probably going to cost a community like ours somewhere between $15 and $25 million for it to be efficient. But 15 or 20 years from now, with ride sharing and other sort of technologies where you may have autonomous driving that's more frequent, will that have been a $25 million project that you wasted money on that's going to limit your infrastructure improvements going forward?
Mm-hmm. That sounds so much like Gallatin. We're exactly there too. I will say that for Gallatin, we have a tremendous opportunity because outside of our historic downtown district, most of our city was built, or a lot of our city was built kind of mid last century. And so that was the time where nobody would walk anywhere for the rest of their lives. So we have 0 sidewalks in all that area. And so we have and we're doing well with making progress with getting sidewalks in, but
is this where Columbia and Gallatin can compete, and I can say, come to Columbia, we have sidewalks?
Actually, we would be great too, absolutely.
That would be good, a competition between the cities, who gets the most sidewalks.
And I do think, on that point, I think when we act as a region together, we succeed. A lot of times in Columbia, I'll tell our city council that when Mount Pleasant or Spring Hill succeeds, then Columbia succeeds. I feel the same way, and that's what I like so much about what we're doing today and the Power of 10 is when there's a win, economic development or otherwise in Rutherford County, I see that as a win for Murray County. Certainly with regard to Nashville, as I said, being the leader of Middle Tennessee, I'm always rooting for Nashville because I know that it's always going to translate into success for our entire region in which we happen to be a part of.
Well, and there's a really interesting thing that happens too. We can tell our citizens something all day long, but when they hear it from the Franklin mayor,
Right.
it's right.
Right.
And so it's that ability we have to influence other communities, not necessarily intentionally, but if we're consistent with good practices and we're supportive of each other and encourage friendly competition,
Right.
then I think we help get things moved along.
There's so much power in collaboration. So much power. I think I only have a couple minutes left, so if each of you just want to give one closing remark to our participants today for about 30 seconds, and that might take me to the end of our time.
Well, I'll just close to once again say thank you. I'm honored to be a part of this panel today, making some relationships I think that'll be good for us. And as again, I'll say, when we act united and when we act as a unified front, as a region, I think the sky's the limit for us. I think we have all of the tools in our tool bag right now to be a region that is at the forefront over the next decade and beyond, led in part by the city of Nashville, but also for the surrounding communities. And the city of Columbia is the southern point tip of the Nashville MSA region, and we take pride in that, and we know we contribute a lot to the problems of transit, transportation, et cetera. And we also know we want to be a part of that solution. And so we're certainly a part of the team, and we look forward to continuing the conversations.
Okay. I'll just say thank you to everyone, and I look forward to us continuing to get better together.
Well, I'll echo the thank you that everyone else has offered, and I'll also say Nashville, the city of Nashville, and the Middle Tennessee region are special places. So let's do this.
Yeah, I just want to add to that and say thank you for including me in the discussion today. I'm excited to go back and watch the presentation again, take some more pointers from it. I think most of all, it just encourages me, and I hope it does everyone else, that as a region, let's keep moving forward. Let's keep trying to do better and progress on some of these initiatives that we'd like to see accomplished.
And again, going last, I get to say what everybody else said is exactly what I'd like to say as well. But I'll just finish up by saying again, thank you for having me part of this panel. But at the one thing that I guess I'll just close with is, we're listening. Are you listening? And we want to continue to push this conversation forward.
That was a powerful last comment. I love that. That was great. And I just want to thank you all. And I just want to say the Power of 10 is just such an important conference in our community. And I appreciate so much being a part of this. And I want to thank all of the panelists and Margot and Shelley today for having all of us here today. So I appreciate you all. Just applaud all of your efforts, not just today, but what you do every day and how you think about people and you keep the people in our communities first.
All right. Thank you so much, Gail, for moderating. Thank you, panelists, for being here with us. This was a great conversation. I think, more than ever, we have to work together as a region. That's what Cumberland Region Tomorrow is all about. We look forward over the next several months to continuing this conversation. Cumberland Region Tomorrow is pivoting to a new purpose, and that is being that source of information on growth and development issues for the whole Middle Tennessee region. Look for your emails for those follow-up forums that will be happening over the next few weeks. I think you're going to enjoy them. And thank you once again for being here. Thanks again to Pinnacle Financial Partners for being our presenting sponsor, Greater Nashville Realtors for hosting Brent, and for all the sponsors that help make this happen.